All right. Being a economic researcher, but not an academic researcher, I'm going to stay here behind the podium so nobody gets confused about my identity. Right. So first, I want to thank John Mayo for including me in this colloquium. I sent my paper to John a year ago around this time when I came to the first colloquium, and I think I have him to thank for the number of invitations I've received since then to present this paper, and it's great because being a novice to this area of economics, I'm always welcoming feedback from outside in case I've gotten some facts wrong. This work is actually serendipitously tied into growing interest in Congress in formulating a national freight policy, but I came to it really by accident, just by a drive down the Shenandoah Valley with my family, and I expected it to be a bucolic drive through rolling hills, and of course Interstate 81 is NAFTA highway, I believe, and I found, you know, what everybody finds, which is a great deal of freight truck traffic on that interstate, and also a rail line right next to the interstate that seemed underused. And it got me thinking, as a resource economist, whether this was a pricing issue, that is, whether we have too much truck freight and not enough rail freight for reasons that prices are not quite accurate. This paper has been published as a working paper at CBO. Ultimately, we'd like it to become an official CBO study. But as you'll see, I'm going to talk about a number of policy options that I looked at in this simulation model, and they are very illustrative of the kinds of effects that policies toward rail or truck freight might have on shippers' mode choice, but they're not policies that Congress, I suspect, would actively consider in the form that I'm looking at them. But still, the work that I've done is very illustrative of the kinds of effects that we might expect freight policy to have. Since this paper was published, so I'm now thinking about coal. A lot of you may be aware of the moratorium recently announced on federal coal leasing, and there are various reasons why that moratorium has been put in place. But in the reading I've done, there's a lot of concern in some circles that that this Powder River coal has been underpriced for years, and it's a giveaway to the mining companies. And as I look into it, I mean, it raises a lot of questions, right? So there are a lot of parties along the supply chain that might benefit from inexpensive coal, including at the end consumers, right? But I'm curious to the extent to which, for instance, the rail carriers, and there are only 2 of them serving Powder River Basin, may also be enjoying rents from this coal. Of course, if it's underpriced, why is the demand for it dropping so precipitously? But I digress. Let me also just say the views I'm expressing are mine, not necessarily those of my employer, Congressional Budget Office. So what I'm talking about today is the simulation model that I built and the policies that I looked at pertaining to this list of external costs related to freight transport. And I was actually helped along my way quite a bit by a paper that the Government Accountability Office published about 5 years ago, where they enumerated a lot of these costs, pulling together research from like the Federal Highway Administration and other sources, and I found that very useful in parameterizing the model that I built. And so I'll go through what the costs are that I'm loading into my model, and then the question is, if freight transport were priced to reflect those external costs, and they're different for truck and for rail, how would that affect shippers' mode choice? So in other words, are we seeing crowded interstates because truck freight is drastically underpriced, or are we seeing crowded interstates because shippers value trucking services quite highly? It's, of course, going to be a mix of those. And the bottom line to the work that I do will give insight into to what extent resources are being misallocated. Okay. So those 5 external cost categories that I listed, I'm ranking them here in order of importance from highest cost to lowest. And I'll start with accident risk. And here I'll just point out, this is uninternalized accident risk. So the carriers, of course, are paying insurance, and so internalizing some of the expected costs of accidents, and they're paying court claims when those situations arise. So this is costs in excess of those internalized costs, as estimated by GAO. And I'll also point out, so in a lot of cases, these data are relatively old, although things change sort of slowly in freight transport. But in particular, so the rail costs definitely predate, the rail costs for accident risk that I have up here definitely predate the rise in crude oil shipping out of the Bakken. But I'll also say, so we've seen a lot of news about big derailments, and there was one just last week. I don't think it was an oil train, the one up in Columbia River Valley, but that those accidents do not necessarily mean, with this crude oil shipping, that the accident risk has gone up. It might have even gone down, because this is per ton mile, and of course crude oil shipments involve a lot of new ton miles and only a few new accidents. So it's an open question whether my having left out Bakken crude oil shipments means that accident risk number is inaccurate. The next one is pavement damage, and of course this is mostly going to be about truck freight. So these numbers here are gross of the fuel taxes that trucking companies pay into the Highway Trust Fund, and of course the Highway Trust Fund is used to repair the damage caused primarily actually by big rigs on the interstates. But I will net out those fuel costs. So when we go to simulating the policy, we're taking account of the fact that trucking companies are already paying some of the damages that they cause on the interstates, although it's the position of the Federal Highway Administration through their cost allocation study that the fuel taxes that truckers pay are not sufficient to cover the maintenance costs that are required. Of course, rail's external costs of pavement damage are very low. For one thing, they operate on privately owned infrastructure, and for another thing, the only place where pavement damage could occur due to rail is at grade crossings. I'll say that there's a freight rail commercial you've probably all seen that sort of causes me to grin a little bit, which is that freight rail industry invests $25 billion a year in the rail network so taxpayers don't have to. And of course, taxpayers wouldn't have to anyway because it's private infrastructure, privately owned infrastructure. But they are making the same point I'm making here, which is that the trucking companies receive an implicit subsidy in that they don't pay for the full amount of the pavement damage that the trucks cause. The next one is air pollution, particulates and NOx. And here, these are national averages, and I've actually, reviewers of my paper have commented correctly, I think, that imposing a per mile or per ton mile tax on freight shipping to internalize particulate damage is not quite an accurate way to proceed because the damages from particulates and NOx are going to be very localized, and so emissions out in rural areas are not going to create the difficulties that they cause in urban areas, the costs being primarily to human health, and that is a correct point. Similarly for traffic congestion, obviously traffic congestion, well, it occurs, as I saw, in rural areas as well, but it's a much bigger problem in urban areas, and so the policies that I simulate are kind of a blunt instrument for dealing with congestion. Ideally, you would price congestion where it occurs, which would place an informational burden on regulators that the policies I'm looking at would not quite do. So I'm simulating a national average traffic congestion price, which is not quite optimal, but it'll make the point. And then finally, carbon emissions, and here, whereas with the other costs, you see I've got a range here. This I should have said earlier. This is the range of estimates that I've found in the literature or in the GAO study, and those are all just a uniform range. But for carbon, I'm using the social cost of carbon, the empirical distribution that the that the US government uses. And so instead of giving an upper lower bound as I did for the other costs here, I've listed the 5th percentile, the 90th percentile, and the median, just to illustrate that those costs have a different source. All told then, per ton mile, the external costs of truck freight are about 8 times higher than for rail freight, okay? And now, so I built a simulation model that it has a number of other random parameters, and as you can all probably imagine, the way the simulation models work, they're going to draw randomly from these ranges and proceed as if those are the realized costs and the realized parameter values. For these external costs, actually, I don't do that, okay? So what I'm assuming is that this is the information set that the regulator works with, and so we're not drawing a random tax amount. We are actually taxing based on the medians of these distributions, and we're keeping, from one simulation to the next, we're keeping the tax rate constant so that we know what we're dealing with, okay? Alrighty, and all right, this next slide, it's the only sort of explicit economics that I'm going to subject you to. It's just an illustration of what's going on in these two markets, right? So shippers have a choice of which mode to use, and if you look at the right-hand panel, the rail panel, okay, so the demand curve has shifted out from D0 to D1 as a result of the tax that's imposed on truck freight, okay? So you've made the substitute mode, truck, more expensive, which causes more rail shippers to be more willing to ship by rail at any given rail price, okay? Similarly, you see on the left panel, the demand curve for truck shipping also shifts out as a result of the tax that's imposed on rail. So both demand curves are shifting out, even though we're making both modes more expensive. Otherwise, these two panels illustrate what's going on in the particular policies that I'm simulating, which is to say the tax on truck shipping is going to be much higher, and I've illustrated that here, than the tax on rail shipping, okay? And so you've got the quantity demanded of rail in equilibrium is going to increase, not to give away the bottom line, and you're going to have more rail shipping and less truck shipping when these policies are imposed. But that's not a necessary condition. You could certainly draw the curves differently by imposing different taxes and get different outcomes, okay? I'm also, these are very stylized drawings. So the trucking industry I do treat in the model as being perfectly competitive, which means flat supply curve. Just for illustrative reasons, I've drawn the rail supply curve as also flat, but in fact I assume it's somewhat upward sloping, which actually has an important implication that trucking firms, being perfectly competitive, don't have the ability to absorb any of these taxes. They pass them entirely along to their shippers, whereas rail, being not perfectly competitive, they have the ability to profit maximize and pass on less than the full amount of the tax, which they're going to choose to do. It gives them a little bit of an advantage vis-a-vis trucking, because any given tax increase on rail, their customers are not going to see all of it, so it makes rail relatively more attractive. Okay, so the outline of the approach. So even though I'm modeling mode choice, I'm not doing a discrete choice model where shippers are optimizing in any sense. I'm just taking their supply and demand curves as given, and I'm applying price elasticities that I get from the research literature, actually from the elasticities that I happen to use. They're very difficult to find, so I've found two competing sets of elasticities. This one came from actually Canada 25 years ago, the Jones and Nix paper. And I do a sensitivity analysis on my choice of which set of elasticities to use, because the other set that I could have used, based in the US market, also around 1990, is utterly different, but it doesn't really change my results too much. Okay, so we take as our initial conditions what the world looked like in 2007 according to the freight analysis framework, which is, you know, largely constructed from the commodity flow survey. So we don't get updates of the commodity flow survey very often. It only comes out every 5 years. So the newest data available are 2012, and I don't believe yet that they have published them to this level of detail I needed to do this work. But so let me defend the presenting a 2007 data on the basis that it's pre-recession. Thank you. Pre-recession, so it looks arguably something like the world we're in now. So then the experiment is for me to impose some taxes. I've got 4 different tax policies that I'm gonna describe. Run them through the price elasticities and just see what happens to the demand for mode shipping by different commodities and different types of service. Okay, and so the kinds of outputs that I'm going to be presenting are how much market shares change in terms of ton miles, what kind of benefits we get in terms of reduced external costs, and of interest to Congress is going to be how much tax revenue these policies might generate. Okay, so the 4 policy options that I look at, the first one is a weight distance tax that is the most informationally intensive, right? So the tax collector has to know how heavy each shipment was and where it exactly went as far as the number of miles it went on. And I've divided that in terms of a per ton mile tax on non-emissions damages, and then I mapped the emissions damages, so that's carbon dioxide and particulates and NOx, into a per gallon tax equivalent to about $1.50 a gallon. And for comparison, the current tax on diesel fuel, it averages about 50 cents per gallon. That's state and local as well as federal. The federal tax is 24.5 cents. And rail shippers or rail carriers don't pay a tax at all on diesel fuel other than just 1/10 of a cent for leaking underground storage. So I'm looking at a weight distance tax of 2.3 cents per ton mile on trucking versus 0.3 cents per ton mile on rail. And then to ease the informational burden on regulators, I also look at a tax that ignores the weight of a shipment, and it's just a VMT tax, a distance tax. And so that translates into a 30-cent per mile tax on trucking and a 12-cent per mile tax on rail, combined with a fuel tax for emissions. And then the other 2 policies are only looking at road damages and accidents, congestion, and only looking at emissions by separating out the VMT tax and the fuel tax. And these taxes, of course, are much higher than anything the carriers are currently subject to, but I'll point out, so containers coming in and out of LA and Long Beach, okay? Containers are assessed right now a $60 per FEU fee by the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles for air quality, and then a $43, as of a few years ago, a $43 per FEU fee for access to the Alameda corridor. So that amounts to over $200 per TEU. That's what you normally see on rail cars, is 20-foot containers. So if rail carriers currently are paying $200 per TEU per container, and they put those in a double-stacked whale car, if they were taxed 12 cents per mile, according to my tax, that tax would not add up to as much as the rail companies are paying at the ports until that shipment has gone 1,700 miles in a double-stacked whale car. So these taxes are bigger than what's currently imposed at the federal level for sure, but they are not huge compared to what other fees these carriers are subject to. Okay, so we're imposing these taxes, which are not exactly incremental. And of course, we're not going to get wholesale shifting. We're only going to get the marginal shipper to switch modes from truck to rail, those who don't have a strong preference for one or the other. And there are a lot of shippers that are not going to switch at all, okay? So shippers for whom only one mode is available, or shippers for whom one mode is ideally suited. Like coal shippers are not going to ship by truck just because you impose a tax on coal shipments. And similarly, short-haul shippers are not going to switch to rail if their route is not well served. Okay, so now my results depend crucially on these shipping rates, and for rail we had fairly good data. Surface Transportation Board regulates rail rates in certain markets, and so we have a fairly good idea of the kinds of rates that shippers are paying for rail service in these different categories, bulk being the cheapest at 3.5 cents per ton mile. We don't have a good idea about truck shipping rates because they're proprietary. I got these rates. They're estimated by actually the Federal Railroad Administration, and so I use those, and my results depend on these because when you're using elasticities to evaluate policy impacts, it's the relative change in price that matters. So even though the tax on truck shipping is going to be 8 times higher per ton mile, truck shipping rates are about 3 times higher per ton mile, so the relative changes are going to be much lower than 8 to 1. So to overview the findings, so the taxes raise the cost of a trip, a given trip to ship by truck, by about 19%, and raises the average cost to ship by rail by 12%. So that's much different from 8 to 1. So the effects vary quite a bit depending on which commodity we're talking about, which route we're talking about. So the simulation model finds little effect on short haul, which is what I would expect. Ditto, bulk transport stays mostly on rail. Imposing what I call the full information tax, this is the weight distance tax on all the external costs, ended up resulting in a shift of ton miles of about 3.6% from truck to rail. Okay, so this answers my question about resource misallocation. If you impose fully the external cost of shipping, which are not small, as we've seen, you don't get a massive shift over from truck to rail. It's meaningful, but it's not massive. The overall freight shipping market contracts a little bit, right, because freight shipping is currently underpriced by our definition. It contracts, though, less than 1%. And these changes translate into using sort of average payload capacities, 3 million fewer truck trips on the highway per year, 0.8 million more rail car trips, because rail cars have bigger capacity, per year. The diesel fuel savings, because rail is more fuel efficient than truck, amount to about 700 million gallons a year. And finally, reduce external costs by $2 billion. Okay, quickly. So what the simulation is based on, my data are annual total shipping between state pairs. So California and Tennessee, how much total tonnage of each kind of commodity went between California and Tennessee. So it's state level, by truck or by rail. Okay, and I'm excluding air, I'm excluding barge, pipeline. And California to Tennessee is one kind of observation. Tennessee to California is a different observation. So between having 39 commodities and all those different state pairs and the 2 transport modes, we end up with about 76,000 observations to play with. To give you an idea of some of the richness in this simulation model, so the randomness that comes, we're going to see in our results, comes from distributions that I've assumed for the shipping rates that we saw. Drayage costs are in there. The transport cost share, the transport share of the cost of production or distribution, right? Because transport is a derived demand, and so if transport costs are only a tiny share of a good's price, then changes in the cost of transport are not going to have a whole big difference on mode choice, whereas if transportation is a relatively important part of a product, as it is for coal, the changes will be bigger. Demand elasticities, I've got uncertainties around those. Rail route circuity, empty returns, I make assumptions about those, tax pass-through rate, and payload capacity. And so in the simulation, so the results I'm going to present are from 1,000 repetitions of this model, each time drawing different values from each of those types of parameters. Okay, so the bottom line results. I've already presented most of these numbers in that little overview. This is my it's called all external cost or full information tax. The only new number in this column that I haven't talked about is the revenue that this policy would produce per year, and the number that I come up with is $68 billion, which is bigger than the entire amount of tax revenue from the diesel and gasoline fuel taxes, okay? So this is a number that is certainly more than I think would be needed for freight infrastructure, okay? So currently we're spending about $45 billion a year, the federal government, on surface transportation, so $68 billion dwarfs that. For rail, we're spending about $200 million a year on grade crossings, okay? And to put this in further perspective, so truck shipping, there's talk now about building a network of dedicated truck lanes to get the trucks off on their own. And if you assume that a 4-lane dedicated truck highway would cost $7 million a mile, you could build about 10,000 miles of dedicated truck highway, that's 4-lane highway, per year with this revenue. So that's why probably this policy is more than what's needed. And for some perspective, so the ENO Foundation just came out with a freight transportation policy paper where all of their policies were geared toward generating about $2 billion a year in revenue. And so, whereas I've got a policy of 30 cents per mile for the distance tax or 12 cents per mile for the rail distance tax, if you shrunk those down to just 3 cents and 2 cents per mile, you'd get just single-digit billions of dollars. This is now going from a weight distance tax to just a distance tax, and I calibrated it to do about the same amount of work. The difference here is that if you're not taxing distance, if you're not taxing weight, you're somewhat distorting shippers' decisions because now you're going to get heavier shipments since weight is not being taxed, but distance is. So there's a bit of a distortion, okay? On the other hand, it's administratively cheaper to manage a tax like that, so there's some trade-offs. And I'll point out, too, that you could actually get just about everything you need, everything that the VMT tax and the fuel tax together do, you could do just by imposing VMT tax by itself, and for a lot less revenue. Okay, let's see. I think I have already made all these points. Yes, so I just have a couple of minutes left. Just a little bit about sensitivity analysis, and then I will end. So the results that I presented are means from 1,000 iterations of the model. By way of sensitivity, so I'm going to present a likely range around the means. This is the sort of the middle 2/3 of the results that came out of the model, and do a little bit of sensitivity tests. So the all external cost policy there that you see, that first column of numbers you've already seen. Those are the means that I presented earlier. And then the range in the second column is what we at CBO call the likely range. It's the middle 2/3, like I said, of the values that came out of the model. So you can see that even with all the uncertainty in those parameters, you get, I'd say, a fairly tight set of results around those mean values. Let me just do quickly some sensitivity. So the Bakken crude issue, like I said, it post-dates the data that I'm using. And so what if the accident rate assumption that I was working with was wrong? So let's double the rail accident rate. So what's going to happen here? Rail becomes a less attractive option. So you're going to get, as a result of this policy, the AEC policy, you're going to get less of a shift to rail. So rather than a 3.6% shift in ton miles, you get a 2% shift in ton miles. But qualitatively, the results are still familiar. So I would say the omission of the Bakken issue is not fatal. Of course, we have drayage and lift costs, so it's not like I would assume them away, but this second column illustrates the role that they play in the results. They're relatively important to the total cost to ship by rail. In some cases, they might be half the cost. And if you take them away, it makes rail more valuable or more attractive, so you're going to get a bigger shift. My point here, though, is that it's obviously not driving the results. Oops. Okay. So these are the elasticities that I use in the model. They are very small for bulk commodities. They're much bigger for finished goods. The other set of elasticities that I could have used, instead of varying from almost 0 to up to about 7, the other set of elasticities all kind of hover around 1. And if I switch to the other elasticities, again, you get a set of results that's recognizably similar, not too different. And then finally, and I'll end with this, we were not certain about the truck rates because, like I said, they are proprietary. So what if we varied them plus or minus 5%? And you can see that the results that I get with higher or lower truck rates sort of correspond to the likely range that I showed earlier. So anyway, so I will just point out the insights that came from this work. So the relative prices of truck and rail are going to have a lot of influence over the impact that any policy that you pick is going to have on your shippers, and that the effects can be expected to vary by commodity and type of service. I'll end there. Okay.
Quick question. So externalities, of course, are very important and often ignored in economic analysis. But so if we, in addition to these external costs that you detailed, what if we took into consideration external benefits like agglomeration effects or growth impacts? How would that change the relative tax rates between the two industries, and how would that impact your results?
Right. I mean, so, you know, if you had external benefits to incorporate in, of course, it would change the tax rates that the regulator might want to impose. I didn't do a lot of thinking about what those external benefits might be. And would you say they would favor rail or trucking?
Well, I think it depends on the location of these the two services. So I think, you know, trucks can go anywhere really, but I think if you brought in a railway into a town, I think the type of investments people might make would be a longer-term investments, and because a railroad is a long-term investment, and you just don't put a railroad there and take it out, whereas a truck service you can actually divert. So I think in terms of that, I think the railways would have a greater agglomeration effect, a greater perhaps growth effect, because that will generate employment within the railway itself. So yes, I think it will actually increase the deviation in cost between the two. So I think it would favor the railways, yes.
Right. I mean, so a benefit would enter a regulator's calculation as a negative cost, let's say. Now, agglomeration effects might be more of a local issue. It might be something for local communities to provide incentives rather than a federal policy. But basically, that's how it works. Yeah.
David, Bill Hunnicky from the STB. You seem to question your truck rate data. I was wondering why you wouldn't use truck cost plus a normal profit as a proxy for truck rate, because you're assuming it's a competitive industry.
Right. So, I mean, I would be happy to. I guess I would say I hadn't come across truck cost data, but if that's an argument for replacing my numbers with those, I'd be perfectly happy to. I mean, it's a modular approach I've taken, so I could swap in any set of data. So these are easily available truck data? Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't looked for that in several years. It's not something we do at the board, but it used to be available 20 years ago. You could come up with there were truck cost models out there.
In fact, that's the Federal Railroad Administration was using one of those.
Why don't you could use their model?
I did do, yeah.
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 Hi, Kevin Hills, Brattle Group. To pick up on a comment that was made this morning, you've left out of your calculation all of the intrastate traffic, which means that you're probably understating the total impacts of this. Do you have any sense about the magnitude of that understatement?
Not really, and you know, for states like California, I imagine, in fact, having lived it, I imagine that the numbers could be quite big. Yeah, I don't have a sense for the scale of it.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting.